I'm Helen.
I'm Taylor.
Ben.
This is our project, A Whale of a Tale, and the basic idea of evolution in our project is the transition from land to water. So mammals that originated on land and transitioned to water, and eventually whales. And so Darwin actually hypothesized in his book, Origin of Species, that whales descended from bears, so he wasn't too far off. And the transitional species that we will discuss today have been found in the last 20 years, so it's kind of a newer field of research.
Set the stage. The time period we're going to focus on today is the Eocene epoch, also known as the dawn of the recent. This epoch lasted about 56 million years ago to about 33.9 million years ago. It is part of the Paleogene period and the Cenozoic era. The Eocene epoch is also known for its warm and humid climate, as well as its subtropical and temperate forests. The average annual temperature for the Eocene epoch is about 30 degrees Celsius, which is higher than any other part of the Cenozoic era. Now, what's so significant about the Cenozoic epoch, Eocene period, epoch, is that is the first appearance of two marine mammal groups, Sirenians and Cetaceans.
Okay, so the first organism we're going to talk about is Pakicetus right here. We have a video that will show something too. But it lived 49 million years ago in coastal regions with fresh water and spent the majority of its time on land. They were mammals that had similar skull structure and ear structure to modern whales. And they also had a similar dental structure with lots of triangular shaped teeth that indicated that they were fish hunters and ate fish. And so they overall they were semi-aquatic and spent most of their time on land, but then would go to the water to eat.
So, like Adri said, there was a driver toward the water because the whales were eating fish. Ambulocetus even more so. It was 48 million years ago and descended from the Pakicetus. There were more food resources available in the water that weren't being utilized, which is what drove them toward the water. They lived in an estuarine environment and nursed their offspring underwater, and the significance of that is that the estuaries had fewer predators and more food sources available to their offspring, excuse me. And then fossil evidence and looking at the isotopes within the bones showed that they drank both salt water and fresh water, so that shows a movement toward the marine salt water. They also had a movement of their nostril up their snout, which allowed them to breathe while also hunting underwater for fish. So they could dip their head farther and farther down into the water to catch fish. Their morphology was also changing, so they had more paddle-like limbs compared to the Pakicetus, and they were a lot shorter. And they were still able to support themselves on land, but their legs were just a lot shorter, so they weren't quite as mobile on land. Their tail had also become more muscular and long, so that shows kind of the transition toward the tail that modern whales have. And then lastly, their feet were less hoof-like than the Pakicetus had, which shows that they were diverging from the ungulates, which are all the hoofed animals that we have today.
And then the next animal that we're going to talk about is the Rhodocedus right here, which lived 46 million years ago. And the Rhodocedus transitioned fully into just salt water, so it was very marine. It spent most of its time there. Its hip bones were not fully fused into a backbone, which allowed them to be more flexible and had advantages in swimming. And they had developing flippers and a tail, which you can see they love to eat. Their tails kind of their nostrils moved back on top of the snout, and they had enlarged ear capsule bones to pull in whales to help them spend a lot of time in the water. And so, when they say, why did they transition to the water? And so there was upwelling in the water, possible from climate change, that allowed all these diatoms and nutrients to come up in cool water on top. And so we think that these animals might have gone to the water for food source.
So the Pterodon is the most like the modern whale as a transitional species. because it was fully aquatic and its nostril was really far back, like the blowhole we see in modern whales. It was an underwater hunter, but it hunts much more like the modern dolphin than does the Rhodocetus. It was a lot faster underwater and more able to catch fish like the Odontoceti that we have today. Their morphology, they had a lot shorter neck than the Rhodocetus, which modern whales obviously don't have much of a neck. And they lost the ankles that the Rhodocetus have and those joints in the front limbs, so they had more of a flipper than a limb. And then very small hind limbs. So they're still there, but they hardly do anything, so they were kind of just becoming irrelevant. And then they also, like Adri was talking about, had the movement of the pelvis downward in the abdomen. So it's becoming more of a vestigial limb that's not really doing much, but it's still there. And that shows fossil support for the transition from land to water for whales. And then the Gerodon, lastly, is the first to show tail flukes, which we see in the modern whale. And that's going to be something Taylor's going to talk more about, is the homology of modern whales.
Okay, so the order Cetacea, which is what whales are in, it includes dolphins, whales, and baleen whales. They all kind of share some general features specific to them. They all have a pair of front flippers. They all have hair as fetuses. They also have the characteristic fluke on their tail. They all can milk their young, and they have the vestigial pelvic bone, which refers back to their terrestrial origins. And they also have their characteristic nostrils or blowholes. All of them have one blowhole, except the baleen whale has two. And they also do not have olfactory senses, so no smell, and they don't have tear glands or skin glands. So kind of neat. There's also molecular evidence for these transitional species. They did a study with different parts of the DNA, such as myoglobin, cytochrome C, and lens alpha crystalline A in different mammal species, and it basically showed that whales are very closely related to artiodactyls, which are basically even-hoofed mammals, so such as deer, cows, and pigs. So whales are distantly related to cows, which is kind of weird. And these artiodactyls are also a subclass of the ungulates that Helen mentioned earlier, which are other mammals. And all of this evidence kind of shows that whales and these ungulates, such as these animals right here, the camel and everything, they all have this common ancestor with the whale. So the molecular evidence and fossil evidence kind of all supports that same conclusion. But there's still kind of a inconsistency in the evidence as far as characteristics that the extinct ancestors share and the extant organisms share. So we think there's still a little bit more to be learned from that, but pretty much all of the evidence supports one another.
Like she was saying, there's another line of evidence we're going to talk about, which is the diversity of living cetacea, which includes the Mysticeti and the Odontoceti. Odontoceti are the carnivorous whales, and then the Mysticeti are our baleen whales, which are our filter feeders. The Odontoceti have really similar dentition to the Pakicetus, so they're carnivorous and they hunt fish in different ways. And then the baleen whales are able to utilize a different food source in the oceans by filter feeding, so they get diatoms and zooplankton out of the water. And that came as a result of upwelling in the Antarctic regions. So when the seasonal changes occur and it gets a lot warmer, there's a lot more diatoms in the water. And the transition to having a baleen instead of teeth allowed them to utilize that food resource. Also, the blowholes differ in different whales. They all have a different shape of their blow, and it's adjusted on their snout to fit their lifestyle. So, for example, the sperm whale dives really, really deep in the water, so when it comes up for air, it needs to be able to access oxygen really, really quickly. So its blowhole is a lot farther up on its snout, so like right when it gets out of the water, it blows. And then also dentition is another line of evidence for the adaptations they have. Some have like a really big incisor, and those are the narwhals, And because they live in an Arctic region, they don't even use their teeth to eat. They just have one long tooth that helps punch through the ice so that they can get air when they're underneath the ice. And then other whales like the dolphins and the killer whales use their teeth to trap fish. They don't even bite into the fish, they just use it to retain the fish, which is different than the Pakicetus would have used them for. And then balines are filter feeders, obviously, so they go at different levels of the ocean, either on the mud flats or at the surface or even just in the open water, filter feeding for diatoms and zooplankton. And then different whales also travel either in pods or solo depending on their feeding type. Some hunt together. For example, humpback whales use bubble feeding. So they'll like blow up bubbles around, they get in a circle and blow bubbles up into the water to trap the fish, and then they just swarm them. So it's kind of like to scare the fish into a frenzy, essentially. And then others just filter feed, like I was saying, so not really much of a panic symptom there. And then they also show different behaviors that kind of show that they were once on land. Like they spy hop, so that's when they pop up out of the water and they look around. They can see, they think it's for landmarking, so they can kind of recognize the land around them. And then lobtailing is used to concuss fish underwater, so that's another hunting mechanism. They'll just slap their tail down on the water, and it kind of stuns the fish for a second so that they can catch them while they're hunting, which is really interesting. So.
And something else that many people may not know is hippos are actually the closest living relative of whales, and a lot of molecular data actually supports this, and they have even suggested that they're so closely related that they should be sister taxa, which is shown on the tree right there. And they kind of discovered this because they found a 28-million-year-old fossil in Kenya, and that fossil and the hippo shared a common ancestor of a four-legged animal. And I think that fossil species may have swam to Africa because of the time period. It was surrounded by a large body of water, so that was kind of the only way it could have gotten there. So that kind of tied in the land to animal transition. And they also both share many characteristics. They don't have hair, obviously. They produce oil in their skin glands, and they also both nurse and communicate underwater. So, and that was our whale of a tale.
Any questions?
So you mentioned that Darwin thought that bears were the closest ancestor to whales. Where did he come up with this hypothesis? Is there anything that supports that?
I think it was actually taken out of, people kind of disregarded it when he wrote it in The Origin of Species because there wasn't enough evidence for it, but he just noticed that whales had certain characteristics that would suggest that they had transitioned from land to water as opposed to just always being in the water, because they shared so many characteristics with land animals.
Other questions? I want to know more about the spy hopping. I've never heard of this. This is so cool.
I only know it
because
because
I've never heard of.
I only know it because of Dr. Kusher, but he talked about last year they have these different behaviors like breaching and lobtailing, and spy hopping is where they kind of pop up out of the water and they're hypothesizing that maybe they're using that as a way of landmarking for breeding purposes or mating purposes, so they can figure out kind of where they are by looking around in like bays and stuff. So it's not concrete evidence of it, but that's one of the theories about why they would spy hop.
So I really like your little skull diagram down there, but I'm not close enough to read the things. So can you walk me through, are those transitional phases, or?
Mm-hmm. It's transitional phases showing the blowhole moving slowly up the snout.
Yeah, like this is the Pakicetus and the Dorygon, and these are modern whales down here.
Okay. Oh, cool.
Did you all come across anything in your searching that talked anything about embryonic characteristics of whales that would also suggest that there was evidence of this transition? Are there things that maybe they had during development that would suggest?
In the embryonic,
I've read something about it. I didn't do it.
in the embryonic stage, all of them have their hind limbs. Yeah, it was all present, and then when they grew, it just kind of disappeared.
So as they proceed through development. Mm-hmm. Super cool. other questions? Nice job.